Hi there, Smart Drivers. Rick with Smart Drive Test, talking to you today about leaving QuickX, running team between Toronto and Vancouver in late 1994, and then in 1995 I moved to a company called Burlington Motor Carriers in Daleville, Indiana. And yes, they speak with that Southern American accent down there, and pick that up quite easily. So that's what we're going to talk about today is running short long haul down in Daleville, Indiana. Stick around. We'll be right back with that story. Hi there, Smart Drivers. Rick with Smart Drive Test, talking to you today about my time with Burlington Motor Carriers working for the Americans. Burlington Motor Carriers no longer exists. It went Chapter 11. Chapter 11 in the United States is bankrupt. It got bought up by another conglomerate. I was reading yesterday when I looked for the picture of one of the Burlington Motor Carrier trucks, as you saw on the thumbnail. And that truck was a Freightliner. It was a cab-over Freightliner. All of the trucks that Burlington Motor Carriers ran were cab-overs, and I had an international cab-over. I didn't have a Freightliner cab-over, but there aren't very many pictures of Burlington Motor Carriers on the internet because it no longer exists as a trucking company. It got bought up by another trucking company. But anyway, one of the things I wanted to show you this morning is a little book of wit and wisdom. This is a book I think my mom picked up for me, and I was looking through it this morning. Always has for inspiration, and one of the things I found in here was a quote that says, "It is an undoubted truth that the less one has to do, the less time one finds to do it in. One yawns, one procrastinates, one can do it when one will, and therefore one seldom does it at all." A quote by Lord Chesterfield. And essentially the quote means that, we don't have anything to do, as we certainly don't have anything to do right now in terms of the lockdown and being at home and social distancing and whatnot. My channel is the litmus test of how much work people are doing for the road tests and practicing driving and those types of things. They simply aren't. And until to pivot in this time of crisis, COVID-19, and how they can get students to continue to train and be motivated. And I'm just like, I'm thinking to myself, until the DMVs open up, driving instructors aren't going to be able to pivot. They're not going to be able to do anything. I know that's kind of a negative attitude, but it really, our industry of being a driving instructor and teaching people how to drive and pass a road test really hinges on the DMVs being open. If those testing centers aren't open, then unfortunately students aren't going to be teaching, training and doing the work that they need to do to pass a road test, because, what's the point? Many of you are probably thinking that your road test has been postponed, it's been delayed. You don't know, your license is going to expire in the next couple of months. You don't know whether they're going to extend it or whatnot. So there's a lot of stuff going on. So, Farron, hello, my friend. Colin is here. Anita is here. Katie and Carrie are both here. Awesome. And that's really great. And everybody's doing well. And I hope you're staying safe during this time. Unfortunately, now that we're kind of into, about week 3 of the lockdown, it's kind of crazy the amount of information that's out there, and the conflicting information that's out there. Is it going down? Is it going away? Are we going to get stuff back together by the end of April here? Let's certainly cross our fingers and hope so. Edeline, awesome! Thank you so much for that, and we're so glad that you're here. Wizzle, Zara from Vancouver, Canada, awesome! Thanks for joining us here. So, let's talk a little bit. I just want to back up a little bit. So basically, I told you, it was kind of the summer of 1994 that I went to work for Atlas Van Lines, the furniture moving company, and there was a couple of details that I remembered that I had completely forgotten about while I was working there. One of the things that I did, during that kind of crazy summer of working and moving furniture was I worked as a swamper, and so other drivers would come in with their trucks, and they had a load to pick up in London, and they were taking it somewhere else. And just bear with me. I'm just going to move the microphone closer here so I get better audio. Went out with these guys, helped them load their trucks and those types of things, and we went up to Hamilton, Ontario, and we did a load, and we're coming back, and we're driving down the road in a rig. There's two of us, swampers and the driver in the truck, and they're sparking up a joint driving down the road, and marijuana use seemed to be fairly high in terms of the trucking industry, especially in the furniture industry, because it's a hard industry. I mean, you're lugging furniture all day, moving stuff, working physically, and then you got to drive the truck all night. So there's quite a bit of, some of the people that I worked with who had been in it for a while, 5, 10, 15 years, they were really hurting. I mean, physically hurting. Their body was hurting because, they just so much physical demand on their body. And I was really kind of glad that I didn't stay in that, because, I would have hurt as well. And, driving truck is hard enough on your body because you're sitting and bouncing up and down the seats and those types of things. But, driving truck is really hard on you too. Farron says that she's safe and sound there in South Africa, but she's bored, as most of us are. I think I'm getting a bit bored too. Frederick from Denmark, Janet is here. Janet says that Denmark's on her bucket list. That's awesome. So really great. So drug use amongst truck drivers and those types of things. It's a little tougher now because they brought in regulations in the 1990s in the United States that all drivers have to be drug tested. So it's a little tougher to drink and drive as a CDL driver. And the other thing is you don't want to take marijuana or any other controlled substances driving in the United States. And for Canadian drivers as well, if you're working for a company that runs into the States, you also have to be drug tested. And drug testing for CDL drivers in the U.S. is pre-employment drug testing. So when you apply for a company and you potentially get hired with them, you have to be drug tested. If you have a crash, you're going to be drug tested. And then the other thing that happens with drug testing CDL drivers, truck and bus drivers in the United States, is that you go into a pool. And then the pool, 50% of the pool is tested for drugs, and 25% of the pool is tested for alcohol once a year. So random sampling of the pool. And basically what there are companies that have been created around this, and this is what they do. So instead of one small company that has 10 drivers and 50% of five of the 10 drivers have to be tested every year, and then 2.5 have to be tested for alcohol, what they do is they take all the trucking companies, put them into a huge pool of say 100,000 or 200,000 drivers, and then they just draw from that larger pool, and that way it makes it less likely that small companies are going to get their drivers pulled. And I'll tell you a story. I was a safety officer years later, and we had a guy pulled on a random at 10 o'clock in the morning, and he went down. He blew like 1.3 on the alcohol test at 10 o'clock in the morning. So, and he comes back and he's like, oh, I had a few beers last night. He's like, you had more than a few beers. And, I'll go into that story in more detail later on, but too much anger and bitterness on his part. And he ended up moving on to a different company after a while. But it was an interesting experience for me as a safety officer, because I never had that happen before, that I had to test somebody and send somebody in. So, it was interesting because he felt betrayed. He felt like I had tricked him, and I was like, well, that as a CDL driver, that you're in the pool and you can be drug and alcohol tested at any time. And that was kind of interesting how all of that worked out. Ryan is here from Saskatchewan. Balwinder, how are you doing, brother? I'm good. Yourself, my friend? Awesome. So, really great. So, anyway, and the other piece... a couple other pieces going back to the furniture moving company in 1994. Believe it or not, there was a dad and a son that were working there, and the son's name was Michael Hunt. Just shorten Michael to Mike, and then just say that over in your head a couple of times. And I used to say to his dad when I worked there, because I'm young, I'm blue collar, I don't really know anything about life. And, of course, I would come in every morning and yell Mike's name. Morning, Mike! With his last name attached. And, I said to his dad, how many drugs were you doing in the 1960s that your last name was Hunt and you named your son Michael? I mean, come on. Really? I mean, what? You don't watch The Simpsons? So poor Mike just, really got taken to town with his name. And I'm sure that he probably has for the rest of his life, which is just really awful for him. Anyway, Farron, truck drivers are taken for granted similarly to garbage collectors and public cleaners. They do so much work and keep the company going, but are not compensated for as much as they should be. Yeah, that's very true, Farron, no doubt. Michael's here, Mohinder, good morning. So that was the story. And the other interesting thing, not right away, one of the other workers one of the other people in the office was working as dispatch, but about halfway through the summer, we had another guy, Bob. He came in and he worked as dispatch, and he'd been an old truck driver. He retired truck driving, and he moved on to be, he was trying to be a dispatcher. He wasn't very good at it, unfortunately, because he was a truck driver and trying to retrain himself, and there isn't a lot of training for dispatchers. But the interesting part about Bob was that I learned, it was totally fascinating why, he was a Harley guy. He had a Harley Davidson motorcycle. He had all the stickers. A lot of it was misogynistic, unfortunately, which kind of bristled me a bit, but interesting guy. And one of the things, he wore a t-shirt one day, and so sitting on this side, so it was his left arm. His left arm had a scar on it. It was completely all mangled. And, I at this point, I finished high school and, didn't really know very much about the Vietnam War at all. Unless, watching movies in the 1970s and 1980s, Rambo and Platoon and those types of movies, but didn't really have like a physical connection with the Vietnam War. And I said to him, one day we were sitting around having lunch or coffee or something, and I said to him, what happened to your arm? And he said, I was in the war. And I said, well, what war? Because he was, he's probably 50 years old at that time. And I said, well, what war? He said, I was in the Vietnam War. And I'm like, but you're Canadian. I said, how could you be in the Vietnam War? And he said, yeah, I volunteered to go to the Vietnam War. And I later found out that when I was teaching university, and I went on to teach the Vietnam War, that here's an interesting statistic about the Vietnam War, that the same number of Americans that dodged the draft to go to Vietnam and fled to Canada and other countries in the world, the same number of Canadians as those Americans that dodged the draft volunteered to go to the war. And he was one of the Canadians that volunteered to go to the Vietnam War. And what had happened, this huge scar, kind of mangled mess he had on his arm, he was in a Huey helicopter going down into a landing zone to pick up a platoon, and one of the Viet Cong fired a .50 caliber weapon. It went through the pilot, killed the pilot, and mangled his arm, and I guess it went into his torso as well. But it was just a massive scar, and it was just like a real eye opener for me that Canadians had been in the Vietnam War. So I just didn't have that kind of worldly experience as well. And him and I got to know each other. He was a really good mentor in helping me learn how to drive truck and getting my license and those types of things, and told me a lot of things that I needed to know about running long haul and getting started as a broker and an owner operator and whatnot. And I do remember him, the thing he said about being an owner operator and driving truck was, he said, in the beginning you're going to eat a lot of peanut butter sandwiches, which meant that it's going to be a tough go at the beginning. So I just wanted to back up to those kind of couple of points about things that I learned that summer and people that I had met, which is interesting. And the other thing that Bob taught me is that closing the barn doors on the back of the trailer, always make sure you look up and make sure that the top of the door is connected, because what happens with semi-trailers is they're going down the road, they create this kind of swirl, tornado is what I'm looking for, around the back of the trailer, and they suck water inside and they'll get the freight wet and those types of things. So you always want to make sure that the top of the doors are closed and look up and check that. And I always had to teach drivers that when I was teaching them to open and close barn doors when I was teaching truck driving. And so that fall in 1994, I drove for Quick X, and I told you the story in the previous yesterday's video, and I'll do another video tomorrow, every day at 11, just telling you stories about driving truck. And I was working with Pierre. We were driving. Pierre and I got along pretty well, but Pierre was having a tough time of it as well. And I just said, no, I can't do this driving team anymore. And I started looking around for jobs, and Burlington Motor Carriers was hiring out of Daleville, Indiana. And I'll just pull the map up here real quick of where Daleville, Indiana is. So just you can see here on the map that Indianapolis is right here. So Daleville, Indiana is about 50 miles northeast of Indianapolis in the state of Indiana there. So, yeah, so I went to Daleville, Indiana, and it was interesting. I got hired down there by an American company to run as a Canadian driver. I later learned that the reason they were hiring Canadian drivers was to pull freight across the border, to clear the border. That's what we were doing. And so, didn't have any money at the time. I just, for some reason, trucking was not paying me a lot of money in the first 6 months, a year of driving truck. And so got a bus. I know that I was thinking about it this morning. I had to take a shuttle to the Detroit airport, and then I got on one of the local transit buses, took it to the Greyhound, and then I took the Greyhound down to Daleville, Indiana. And I had to get an advance on my pay when I was there, because I think the training was like a week, 6 days of being trained when we were in Daleville, Indiana. And the other interesting thing is that the first 5 or 6 days that we were there, we got put up in a pretty nice hotel, like kind of 3.5, 4-star hotel, and did the training down there, all of the, defensive driving, backing, freight sheets, bills of lading, all of that sort of, stuff that you go through with the company. And, it was a big US company. So it was like 4 days of training, and we stayed in nice hotels, and I think there was a pool as well. And so got done the training. Some interesting people on the course as well, and some Americans, and just love Americans, especially Americans from the South and whatnot. And at the end of the training, they said to me, "Oh, your truck's coming in." I guess they had another driver who was quitting and was supposed to be coming in, and so they put me up in another hotel, a different hotel, not the one that I got to stay in for the first 4 or 5 days that I was being introduced and trained while I was at Burlington Motor Carriers. And the other thing, I don't know whether you can see this on the map or not. I'll just go back to the map here for a second and focus. Yeah, here we go. Where did it go? Daleville. There we go. So Daleville, Indiana. You can see that Daleville, Indiana is right on Interstate 69. Which in and of itself, and kind of a grade 8 humor, is funny too. But the hotel that they put us up in after the training was finished was right on the interstate. It was probably a 1.5 star. There's no, it was actually a motel, right? One of those, buildings that's got, a parking lot down the middle between the two sections of the motel, and it's just a room with a bed and a toilet, right? With some hammered together furniture, beds made out of hew and planks they found out at some construction site and whatnot, with the mattress thrown on it, right? Basically 1.5, 2 stars motels that you got stayed in. And kept going back, kept talking to dispatcher, and the interesting part, the concept that Burlington Motor Carriers tried to implement was that it was only 6 drivers to a dispatcher, or 6 or 10 drivers. They tried to limit the number of drivers that were assigned to a dispatcher, and the dispatcher kept saying to me, "Oh, come back over," and of course this is the day before cell phones and text messages, and they can't just message you and say, "Listen, your truck's here, come and get it." Those types of things, right? So, I kept walking back to the company, which was, it was 5 blocks away or something. It was a 10-minute walk, and walked over there, and they'd say, "Oh, just come back and and one day they said to me, "Come back and stay in the driver's room, and your truck will be here this afternoon." I said, "No." I said, "That's not going to happen." I knew enough about trucking even at that point to say to him, "No, when the truck gets here, I'll come out of the hotel room. But until then, I'm staying in the hotel room," because it was just, sitting around driver rooms. Unfortunately, when you're laid over on a long haul and you're stuck in a driver's room somewhere, it's not very interesting. You definitely want to go somewhere else and be in a hotel or be somewhere comfortable, especially in your truck and whatnot. So, That's what happened. Yeah, Carrie, interesting to hear about those that mentored you. Yeah, I had quite a number of people that helped me out. Ryan lived in Canada, got hired by a U.S. company. Yes, I did. And Ryan, just saying that, it wasn't just Burlington Motor Carriers. I know that Schneider National out of Green Bay, Wisconsin, one of the bigger U.S. companies, they also hire Canadian drivers. And when I worked at Ontario Truck Driving School in London, Ontario, Schneider National was hiring a huge number of Canadian drivers to run freight in and out of Canada. And Janet, where did I grow up? I grew up in London, Ontario. Yes, it was Ontario that I grew up in, and come back every summer to visit with my mom. And just saying that, Ryan, in terms of Canadian drivers working for U.S. companies and U.S. drivers working for Canadian companies, as a Canadian driver, essentially it still works the same, that you're still a Canadian driver. You're working for an American company. They're paying you. But the American company has a Canadian subsidiary. That's how they do it. So they have an office in Canada that allows them to hire Canadian drivers. So as a Canadian driver working for an American company with a Canadian subsidiary, you still have to pick up freight in Canada, haul it into the U.S., get a load in the U.S., and come back to Canada. You cannot, it's called interstating. If you pick up a load in the U.S., so say, for example, that you were in Chicago, Illinois, you pick up a load and you take it to New York and you drop it in New York and you pick up another load and then you come back to Canada, that's illegal. You can't do that as a Canadian. And an American, the same. They cannot bring a load into Canada, into Toronto, for example, pick up another load in Toronto and take it to Saskatchewan and then go back to the States. They can't do that. That's called interstating, and it's illegal according to immigration laws, because what will happen is that you're taking jobs away from the other country, and you can't do that. But as a Canadian, you can haul into the States, pick up a load in the States, and bring it back to Canada. That's legal. Mohinder, sorry, could you guide, please, how to overcome that fear? Which, Mohinder, what are you talking about in terms of fear? Did I get paid American? No, like Farron, because I was working as a Canadian driver and they had a Canadian subsidiary of the trucking company, I still got paid in Canadian dollars. If you work as an owner-operator, there are some companies that will pay you U.S. dollars. It depends on who you're working for. So, later on, by 1996 and 1997, when I was driving into the States, it was tough driving into the States at that point, because the Canadian dollar was like 50 cents on the American dollar. And I can remember a time that I drove into the States and I took $20 out of an ATM machine in the U.S. And by the time I got all the charges done at home, it was $40. It was $40 Canadian that came out of my account. So there was a time that the Canadian dollar was really, really terrible in terms of the exchange rate and whatnot. So, some interesting experiences in terms of learning to drive single by myself with Burlington Motor Carriers was one of the things. And I can remember the first trip that I took, and any time that you went past HQ in Daleville, Indiana, they would pull you in and they would do an inspection on your truck. Just preventative maintenance stuff that they were trying to do. And so, it's first trip, I'm by myself, running single, and, I'm concerned about my logbook and those types of things. So I came down, and I'm like 2 or 3 hours ahead of my logbook. And so I just pulled in and stopped and waited 3 hours, and I got down there. Nobody questioned me. Nobody asked me anything about my logbook or wanted to see my log sheets or whatnot. And I was like, oh, so that's how it works. Nobody cares except the DOT. And from then on, I just, carried on with my life and did my thing. Janet, so straight across the border then. One load into the States and then back into Canada. Yes, Janet, that's the way it worked. Now, just to clarify on that as well, Janet, when we were running through the States, when we were running Toronto to Vancouver, that was called, what the heck was that called? It was called an interstate permit. An in-transit permit. That's what it was called. So basically what would happen is that you would go into customs at the U.S. You'd fill out the paperwork for an in-transit bond. They would come out. They would seal the trailer. So there were seals on all the doors on the trailer, usually just on the back because they were a freight trailer. And then you would drive through the States. You got to the American customs at the other end. You would go back into American Customs, you would hand in the manifest, they would come out and check the seals, and then you would carry on with going back into Canada. That's how that worked. Farron, must be fun converting kilometers to miles. Yes. Farron, because I drove in the States so much, I can do that fairly easily in my head. I can do both imperial and metric. I can work in either system. A lot of people can't do that. So I can do miles per hour, and I can convert miles to kilometers and those types of things. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on there. So, I learned how to run signal. I slept in the truck. I learned how to sleep in the truck and those types of things. And, trucks were not what they are today. A couple of years ago when I went and drove trucks, they now have extra battery packs on them to heat the bunk. But at that time, trucks had to run. There was only 1 or 2 times during the year that you didn't have to run the truck when you were sleeping in it. Basically spring and fall. But the first time, I remember this, they sent me to Texas, pulled into a truck stop in Texas in the middle of the summer. It must have been 120 degrees. And I get into the truck stop, and I didn't really click very, very fast. But I get into the truck stop, and I park the truck, and I shut it off, and I was like, why are all these other trucks running? So I go in and have something to eat in the truck stop, come back out, get back in the truck, climbed in the bunk. Didn't dawn on me that it's 4,000. And very quickly that you had to run the truck to have the air conditioning on so you could sleep inside this metal box. Okay, Mohinder, I got my Class 5 driving license in March this month. I still hesitate to drive on highways and intersections. Your tube clipping helped me a lot earning my license. How to overcome fear. Okay, so Mohinder, what you have to do is now is an excellent time, Mohinder, to drive around and overcome that fear. Simply drive around on back streets that have low density traffic. Get used to, get used to the car, get used to backing up, and those types of things. And send me an email, rick@smartdrivetest, and I'll send you the video on fear and anxiety. Okay? So, going back to, Burlington Motor Carriers. The other thing that happened was a lot of the loads went into Toronto in Ontario. Most of the freight does go into Ontario. For those of you that know anything about Ontario, Canada, Ontario is the most populated province in all of Canada. Most of the population in Ontario lives in southwestern Ontario. Ontario has a population of 12 million people, as opposed to Quebec, which has 8 million people, and the next one after that is 4.5 million people, which is British Columbia. So it's the biggest province, the most populated province in Canada, and the 401 highway, the freeway that runs from Detroit, Michigan up to Toronto, Ontario, and through to Montreal, is the busiest commercial highway in North America. It's even busier than most of the interstates in the U.S. And most of the freight used to go in to the States. And so I got pretty good at running into Toronto a lot. And as Janet will tell you, there's a big, huge Schneider Meat sign at mile marker 299. And we had a saying that we were running into Toronto that if you didn't go past that sign at 5:30 in the morning, you were going to sit in traffic in Toronto, because it was just bumper to bumper, 6 lanes of traffic. It was, it's 8 lanes now, with 8 lanes of through lanes, or 4 lanes through lanes, and then 4 collector lanes. And this one time I had a load going into Toronto. It was a load of bottles, and it was going to Etobicoke, which was probably my other mistake. And I kind of allowed myself 2.5 hours to get into Toronto from London, but 2.5 hours wasn't a lot. I probably should have left 4 hours. So got into Toronto, got in there late. I was like 2 hours late getting into Toronto. I got stuck in traffic and those types of things, and the dispatcher just had to go up one side of me, down the other. And I just realized at that point that the only reason Canadian drivers were working for an American company was to pull freight into the U.S. Pulled a load of juice out of Toronto into Detroit, took it into the yard, because Burlington Motor Carriers had a yard in Detroit as well. And, you do all the work of going into Toronto, putting the load on, which, the load can take you anywhere from 4 to 6 hours to get into the dock, and then they put the freight on the back of the truck. And then, you got to weigh it. You got to make sure that it's compliant for American standards, which is 80,000 pounds, 12,000 on the steer axles, and then 34 on both of the other tandems. And you got to weigh it, and then you got to clear customs. And, it's only a 4-hour run from Toronto down to Detroit on a straight shot through the 401 highway. And I realized after a while that running by the mile for this company, I was not making any money at all, because we were the ones doing all the work, dropping the load in Toronto, or in Detroit rather. And then the American driver would come up, pick it up in Detroit, and then they would take it down to Georgia or take it down to Texas or wherever. So, you know, near the end, I wasn't making a lot of money, and I was like, yeah, it's time to move on from this company, because it didn't make a lot of money. But I did learn, you know, I did really kind of cut my teeth there in terms of learning how to get into the States, how to clear borders by myself, how to fill out logbooks, and those types of things. So it was a good experience working for an American company. But again, the point is that you got to work for a few companies at the beginning to kind of figure out what you really want to do in the end and how you're going to make money. And the next company that I went to work for, I actually did make money for them. So that's what happened. There we go. Okay, so Mohinder, you're most welcome. Okay, so Mohinder, just send me an email, rick@smartdrivetest, and then I can just send that back to you, okay? Farron, I just divide everything by 1.36 to change from metric to imperial. I'm not sure that's going to work for you, Farron, because a kilogram is divided by 2.205. And so 1.36 is a big difference between 1.336 and 2.205. Janet, Toronto is retarded anymore. Doesn't seem to matter the time of day. Yeah, it's just crazy traffic. Yeah, it's a little bit like Atlanta, Georgia. So yeah. So eventually I had a falling out with Burlington Motor Carriers in terms of, you know, not making very much money and doing a lot of work for the American drivers. And shortly after I stopped working for them, they went Chapter 11 anyway, and the company got, it's got taken over by another large conglomerate. Even though it was a very large company in the U.S., it wasn't nearly as big as Schneider National, which is the big orange pumpkin trucks. But worked for them for a few months, and got to know my way a little bit around New England and up and down the eastern seaboard. But for the most part, near the end of it, what I ended up doing was just basically pulling freight out of Toronto, Ontario into Detroit, so the American drivers could take it and deliver it into the U.S. and whatnot. So that was my experience working with Burlington Motor Carriers and working for an American company and running interstates and those types of things. But, as I said, you got to work through a few companies in the beginning to kind of understand where you want to work and how you're going to make money and the kind of work that you actually want to do working for a company. And the next company that I went to work for, MacArthur Express out of Cambridge, Ontario, hauling office furniture for Steelcase, I actually worked for them for more than 2 years. Before that didn't work out anymore. Ryan, it is boring to drive the Trans-Canada Highway when you drive truck. Yeah, and the other thing about driving the Trans-Canada Highway, Ryan, is it's a lot of work because it's 2-lane skinny up and down hills through northern Ontario. And every time I drove in northern Ontario, I used to say to myself that it was some interesting scenery: rock, tree, utility pole, lake. Rock, tree, lake, utility pole. I mean, that was basically driving in northern Ontario. There's not a lot up there. So yeah, so tomorrow we'll talk about driving for MacArthur Express, actually making some money in the industry. It took me the better part of 6 months before I got into a company that I actually started making money, and we'll tell you some stories about that. So thanks very much for hanging around, listening to the stories. If you have any questions at all about driving truck, driving in the States, driving team, driving single, more than happy to answer your questions. And if you are indeed one of those rare people who are working on preparing for your license, air brakes, getting your first license, those types of things, drop us a note down in the comments and we'll be more than happy to help you out. And if you're watching on the replay, hit that thumbs up button and share it around on social media, and we'll all make it through this lockdown. And remember, pick the best answer, not necessarily the right answer. Have a great day. Bye now.